I'm going to tell you a story, and at first it's going to sound like a story you've heard 100 times before, but as you pay attention, you'll notice that this isn't quite the same old story again. In the beginning was the One, and the One was in all, and the One was all, and nothing existed but the One. The One encompassed all being, and all being was the One, and there was no duality. All was one, and so there was one. Then the One had a thought, and the thought was different from the One. The female thought loved the male One, and the One loved its thought, and so there were two. And so the One and his wife, the thought, produced an offspring in their image, a male and a female, like their parents before. And so time passed, and then there were four. And these offspring loved each other, the male and the female, and they produced an offspring in their image, male and female both. And so there were more. And on and on and on and on this went in the place before places as one became many. But then, a mistake. Sophia, the youngest female principal, loved her husband Anthropos, but attempted to reproduce without her husband's help, and the result was the flaw. Sophia's mistake, a misbegotten child wrapped in a cloak of dark matter, and so she cast him away and covered him in darkness to hide him from the cosmos. The child of chaos looked around at the undulating matter that it was born in. He did not know his mother, and he was alone. But nascent memories of the cosmic realm lingered in his mind, and so he molded the matter of his afterbirth into a world. And over the world he built 7 heavens in the sky, and placed a planet in each one. He created 7 suns and set them to rule the heavens, 1 sun for each heaven, and he set himself up as king over the cosmos. And out of his ignorance he spoke, "I am God, and above me there is no other." But Sophia was watching. She and Anthropos drew near, and she said, "You lie, child of chaos, for there is Anthropos, and even the son of Anthropos." And the child of chaos looked up at the dark shroud that his mother had cast over him, and in its watery surface he saw the image of his would-be father, Anthropos. The child of chaos was shaken, and all his sons with him, and he crafted images of what he had seen out of the dust of the earth. He molded them as he had molded the animals, and the first humans were born. Unintelligent, blind, and not possessing souls, they rolled in the dirt like worms, and the child of chaos placed them in a garden of sensual delights to distract them from their pain. And Sophia looked down again, and she had mercy on the poor creatures, made in the image of her husband, who came into existence at the will of the child of chaos. Gaining permission of the One, Sophia took fragments of the One itself and placed them in the humans, and they became wise. And Adam and Eve had a son named Abel in their image. The child of chaos was angry when he realized that his unknown mother had intruded upon his plans. His son slept with Eve and bore another son named Cain, who killed the good son Abel. But Adam and Eve escaped the garden and bore 2 children, Seth and Nerea, a male and female in the image of their parents, just like the aeons above. Sophia and Anthropos appeared to them and gave them gnosis, knowledge that their souls are fragments of the divine realm beyond, and that they can escape the dark world of the child of chaos. And so Adam and Eve spoke, and Seth and Nerea wrote this knowledge in secret books and preserved them for later generations. And thus is the state of the mistake. The world that we inhabit, the afterbirth of the child of chaos, molded into a form and imitation of the cosmic realm above, and a pale imitation at that. And only through acquiring knowledge of our cosmic realm and cosmic origins can humankind escape this place and return to that place from whence our souls came. And this practice can be accomplished by the acquisition of knowledge, of gnosis. Look, I know it's a gimmick to put microphones on funny things for some people, but this is legitimately the only thing I can find within arm's reach that's, not my hand, so we're going to go with this. If somebody were to ask me what the most misunderstood religion in the world is, and don't worry, nobody's bothered to ask me that, I would answer undoubtedly Gnosticism. Gnosticism gets misunderstood by both opponents and proponents, by Christians and atheists alike. So in this video, we're going to answer the question, what is Gnosticism really about? But before we talk about what Gnosticism is, we're going to start by talking about what Gnosticism isn't. And this applies to both Christians on the one hand and non-Christians on the other. So we'll start with the Christians. Okay, so for the Christians in the audience, Gnosticism is not just anything that you dislike. I've seen it increasingly popular in recent years to call anything that you disagree with or don't like Gnosticism, and that's really historically and theologically inaccurate, I have to say. I've seen philosophies referred to as Gnostic. I've seen theologies referred to as Gnostic. I've heard scholars referred to as Gnostic. I've heard economical theories referred to as Gnostic. Not everything you don't like is Gnostic. And this isn't just a complaint with modern Christians. It's been like this for a long time, too. The reason we assume that anything that looks Christian but kind of isn't is Gnostic is because some of us have read the ancient church fathers, the earliest Christians, and they argue against Gnostics. And we assume that basically everyone that the church fathers argued against was therefore a Gnostic, and therefore anything that disagrees with Christianity is called Gnostic. No, that's not how that works. And to my atheist friends out there, you're not off the hook either, because especially during the New Atheism, some atheists looked at the Gnostics and saw how they were persecuted by early Christians. They also saw that the word Gnostic means somebody who knows. And so this myth emerged that the Gnostics were sort of these scientists and philosophers who really valued scientific knowledge about the world around them, and they were persecuted by those evil dogmatic Christians. In reality, if Gnostics continued existing until today, they would have been the subject of just as much ridicule by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins as Christians are, if not more. In fact, they were actually mocked by the philosophers of their own days, but we're getting ahead of ourselves already. The point is that most people today don't know what Gnosticism is, and frankly, I don't blame you, because we really didn't have a good definition of it until, very recently. So it's nobody's fault, but a lot of the information out there on what Gnosticism is, whether it's from Christians, atheists, or everybody in between, or even modern neo-Gnostics, isn't particularly good information on understanding ancient Gnosticism. So that's what I want to clarify on this video, is what is Gnosticism? For anybody out there who has absolutely no idea what Gnosticism is, or maybe you've only heard the word used once or twice, Gnosticism is a religious phenomenon that showed up on the map around the same time that early Christianity did. In a lot of ancient Christian writings, we find church fathers arguing against the Gnostics, arguing that Christian theology was superior to Gnostic theology. A lot of Gnostic theology also involved the figure of Jesus, whom they held in very high reverence. And so there came to be a bit of a rivalry between Christians who worship Jesus and Gnostics who worship Jesus, among the various other responses to early Christianity from Jews, Romans, and Greeks alike. So essentially, Gnosticism is an ancient religion that shows up on the map around the same time as Christianity, but as we'll discuss, it probably got there a little bit earlier. So now that we have our context established, let's try to talk a little bit about what Gnosticism is. But first, we have a problem. And the problem is Gnosticism is probably the single most diverse religion that I have ever seen on the face of the planet. And that's saying something. Because of all this diversity, some scholars have actually advocated abandoning the term Gnostic altogether because it's kind of unhelpful. Like, if you have this group of people here whose theology is one way, and that group of people there whose theology is another way, and yet we're categorizing them under the same umbrella, does that make any sense? Now multiply that by dozens of different groups. So does the term Gnostic even make sense? So some scholars advocate making Gnostics basically an offshoot of early Christianity, just an alternative form of early Christianity. That's not a great idea for a couple of reasons, one of them being not all Gnosticism involves Christianity, but others identify them as a form of Neoplatonism, which they have a lot of correspondences with. And yet there's some noticeable distinctions from that as well. And so some scholars, although arguing that distinguishing Gnosticism as its own category is a mistake, I still think it's the best option laid out in front of us. But there's another reason to believe that Gnostic should be a proper category for all of these different groups, and that's because despite the dramatic diversity that Gnostic groups show, nevertheless, the same core meta-narrative or story and the same basic theological system is found more or less intact in virtually all of them. So while they were radically diverse theologically, there's sort of this underlying spine or skeleton to all of their theologies. Now, even this underlying layer is very different from one to the other, but the outline of the story is roughly the same, I would argue, and that's what we're going to talk about next year. So essentially, what I think allows us to identify a document, a movement, or a person as Gnostic is their adherence to a very particular meta-narrative, a story that undergirds all of their theology. So I'm going to go through that meta-narrative now, and this is the thing that more or less shows up in pretty much every Gnostic group. Now, that being said, the version of this story that I'm going to recite for you now is essentially not preserved in any single Gnostic document. You can read every single Gnostic document on Earth, as I have, and you won't find this precise story laid out in detail there. But consider this sort of the archetypal story that all of the Gnostic groups more or less draw upon. So the first element of the Gnostic story, and thus the theology that flows out of it, is the concept of the One. The concept of the One is probably drawn from Pythagorean or Neo-Pythagorean theology, and it's the idea that at one point, at the start of everything, before time, before space, before everything of that nature, all of existence, all of reality was one. There was no dualism. There was no difference between left and right, up or down. There was just one. Everything was one. And this is the idea of the One, or the monad. It's typically just called the One in Gnostic texts, but some also refer to it as bythos, which translated from Greek means depth, this idea of a deep thing. And there's a couple other names that typically get applied to it as well, Abraxas being one of them, or Abraxas. I get the spelling mixed up all the time, but it's typically just referred to as the One. But it would be boring if the One was just kind of hanging out there in space, so this leads us to our second major universal concept, and that's the idea of the consort. Every Gnostic system has the idea that the monad, all of reality compressed into a single point, has a thought. And now, as I was saying, the second theme that's universal to all Gnostic systems is the idea of the consort. This is almost universally described as the first thought of the One. So essentially, all reality exists in the monad, the One, just doing its thing, right? But then the One has a thought. And now the thought is different from the monad itself. Kind of like how when the brain develops a thought, the thought and the brain aren't the same thing, even though one of them came from the other. So the thought and the One are different, and therefore we have duality. There's something new introduced into the aspect of reality itself. The thought of the One is universally considered to be female, and after this point, the monad, or the One, is universally considered to be male. So we have a male and female pair. And so naturally, the male and female pair come together to create a pair of offspring between the One and the first thought. This leads us to point 3 in the universal Gnostic story, and this is the generation of the aeons. Aeon is the term that the Gnostic texts use to describe the divine beings who are generated by the union of the One and its first thought. They always come out as a male and a female pair, more on that in a second, and they generally produce one after the other. In classical Gnostic thought, it's the One and the first thought which produce all of the aeons in succession. So the One and the first thought produce the first set of aeons, then the One and the first thought produce the second set of aeons, the One and the first thought produce the third set of aeons, and so on and so forth. In some systems, though, like the Valentinian systems, we actually see that the One and the first thought create the first set of aeons. Then that first set of aeons produces the second set of aeons. The second set of aeons produces the third set of aeons, and so on and so forth, literally almost ad infinitum. And the production of spiritual beings called aeons leads us to section 4 of the universal Gnostic story, the fall of Sophia. Sophia is a name that's universally across the board given to the lowest feminine aeon. The time came for the female aeon and the male aeon to procreate and produce the next set of aeons. But the female aeon got a little bit ahead of herself. Her name was Sophia, if I didn't make that clear. Sophia wanted to reproduce without the consent of her husband. Anthropos, who was doing something different at the time, just wasn't really interested in moving forward with it. So Sophia got ahead of herself and attempted to reproduce the next series of aeons without the male element. And the result of Sophia's mistake was the production of the demiurge and the material world. Typically, it's portrayed that both the demiurge and the material world are created at the same time, and that Sophia, horrified by what she's done after seeing that this is a misbegotten child, essentially throws them away and covers them up in a shroud of darkness. And this leads us to section 5 of the universal Gnostic story, the demiurge. The demiurge is the creator of the physical world. He's the former of the reality that we currently inhabit. And pretty much across the board in Gnosticism, this figure is referred to as Yaldabaoth as his given name. The demiurge, Yaldabaoth, comes to his senses and looks around himself, unaware of where he came from or what's going on, and sees that he exists in matter. It's a confusion of matter, however. There is earth, air, fire, and water, the 4 nations, as we all know, but these are just sort of floating around in space at this point. And so he takes it upon himself to mold and form these into proper formation, and thus he creates the physical world that we inhabit to this day. Now, importantly, around the time that Gnosticism came onto the scene, the world map that most people had in their heads looked something like this. So the idea is you have Earth at the center, And then beyond Earth, there is a clear sphere rotating around the Earth. And embedded in this clear sphere, which is called the first heaven, is the moon. Beyond the sphere of the moon, there's another sphere wherein is embedded Mercury. Beyond this is another sphere wherein is embedded Venus, and so on and so forth until the 7 classical planets are filled out. So we have Earth at the center, surrounded by a clear sphere, which is the heaven of the moon, surrounded by another clear sphere, which is the heaven of Mercury, on and so forth, until all 7 classical planets are filled up. On the outside of these, there is an 8th sphere, where all these stars are embedded in, and it was believed that this sphere revolves around the Earth. Some also theorize that there was a 9th sphere, which sort of pulled all the other spheres along in motion, but the results and details of that vary from philosophical system to philosophical system. And by the way, the reason that the ancients looked at it this way is because these 7 classical planets, and yes, they included the sun and moon as planets at this time, move in a way that is irregular. That's to say, the stars in the sky seem to follow the same course every single night, so they were all assumed to be orbiting in the same plane. And yet, Venus and Mercury and the sun and the moon sort of have their own orbits. So the ancients thought, well, they're not embedded in this great sphere at the edge of our sight. Rather, they're in these intermediary spheres orbiting along their own ways. And so it was believed that there were these clear, almost glass-like domes that the planets were embedded in that were rotating. And as those spheres rotated, so too did the planet that was embedded in them rotate. Some philosophical systems also believe that these spheres were inhabited by heavenly or spiritual beings as well. They're called angels in later systems, but that's really not until the post-Christian era. But there was this idea that there were these cosmic beings living in these heavens, and this is also what we see in Gnosticism. So like I said, this is the map of the universe that the Gnostic writers are assuming. And so they believe that the demiurge Yaldabaoth, once he's born into darkness and with matter all around him, forms the universe into a 7-tiered cosmos, with an 8th kind of orbiting around the end of it. After Yaldabaoth forms the cosmos in this way, he then produces 7 sons of his own, called archons, and the archons he assigns to the 7 various heavens. Depending on the system, Yaldabaoth himself either rests in the outermost heaven, or in most systems, he lives on Earth itself. Now, after the demiurge, Yaldabaoth has had his fun and organized his material world into the cosmos that we all know and love, he decides to exalt himself above everything that exists and say, "Behold, I am God, and above me there is no other." And this prompts a response from his mother, Sophia, who's been watching him this whole time, although Yaldabaoth is not aware of her presence. Sophia responds with the name of her husband, telling Yaldabaoth, "You lie, Yaldabaoth, for there is Anthropos and even the son of Anthropos." After this, Sophia's husband, an Aeon named Anthropos, who was supposed to be the person to help generate the next Aeon pair, descends into Yaldabaoth's dark world, and Yaldabaoth and the Archons witness his would-be father and tremble with despair. But this actually gives the Archons an idea, and so Yaldabaoth and the Archons come together, and they make a clay image of the thing that they saw, and they call it Adam, and Eve is usually involved there as well. This is the creation of the first humans, and they put them into a paradise setting where they can wander around and basically enjoy sensual pleasures without worrying too much about where they come from. Now, unfortunately, Yaldabaoth, being an imperfect being, is only able to create other imperfect beings. The Archons are imperfect in their own way, and the human images of his father Anthropos are also imperfect. In fact, many texts say that the first humans that Yaldabaoth made were basically rolling around in the mud like worms, unable to function properly and totally lacking in mental faculties. Now, Sophia is still looking down at all this while this is going on here, and so she has pity upon the humans which were made in the image of her husband. And so she goes before either the One or the Council of the Aeons, sources are disparate on this matter, and she asks permission to take some fragments of the divine realm and embed them into these humans which were made in the image of Anthropos, her husband. The Aeons and or the One give her permission to do this, and she takes fragments of the divine pleroma, the divine realm, down and embeds them in the souls of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve then wake up. They look around themselves and they realize, hey, I can think. I have a soul. I have faculty. What's going on here? Now, pretty much everything I've said up to this point is contained in most Gnostic stories, but when we start getting to Adam and Eve, the stories diverge really aggressively here. So most systems would say that Adam and Eve have children. Sometimes it's portrayed that Abel is born from Adam and Eve, but that the Archons, the sons of Yaldabaoth, sleep with Eve, and that's how Cain is produced, who kills Abel. But importantly, Adam and Eve eventually produce Seth, the righteous son, and Nerea, their righteous daughter and Seth's sister. And in case you're wondering, no, Nerea doesn't show up in the Bible, nor, to my knowledge, in any non-Gnostic text. She's an entirely Gnostic creation. Seth and Nerea have souls like their parents, and at some point, either during the time of Adam and Eve or in the time of Seth and Nerea, Sophia descends into Yaldabaoth's dark world one more time. And while she's down there, she reveals herself to Adam and Eve, or Seth and Nerea, and informs them that they're actually fragments of the divine realm. This here, for the first time, we encounter Gnosis. Gnosis in the Gnostic system is the knowledge that your soul is actually a fragment of the divine pleroma, and that by realizing this, you can escape from Yaldabaoth's dark world that we all exist in and be reunited with the true cosmos beyond the cosmos. Now, what I've just described to you is more or less what shows up in every one of the various Gnostic systems. Some of them will leave out parts of this story, others will add to it, and others more or less follow exactly what I just said. But I think it's important to mention this next portion as well, because in some Gnostic systems, they also get Jesus involved. So the myth that we've been discussing so far has been set in the mythic past, the Garden of Eden, the creation of the cosmos, and even before the creation of the cosmos, right? But a lot of Christianized Gnostics believe that at some point, thousands of years later after Adam and Eve, it was necessary to once again bestow Gnosis upon humankind because apparently we had forgotten it or something of that nature. And so one of the Aeons descends from the Pleroma down into Yaldabaoth's world again and manifests himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, to the Gnostics, Jesus wasn't the savior of the world. He didn't die on a cross for the forgiveness of sins. He didn't teach about the kingdom of heaven, but rather he came down to tell humankind exactly what Sophia told Adam and Eve. Namely, that human souls are fragments of the divine, and that by realizing that and obtaining that knowledge, that gnosis, you could escape this dark world, leave it all behind, and ascend to the cosmic pleroma from whence you came. Now, again, the earliest Gnostic systems did not include this. Gnosticism, as we'll find out, seems to have predated Christianity. And so this story seems kind of tacked on to the rest of the story that we talked about, but it was sufficiently popular in the ancient world that it deserves comment. So that's the Gnostic story in a nutshell. In the beginning, there is the One. The One has a thought, which is separate from itself, and the One and the thought produce a system of aeons, spiritual emanations emanating out from the One. The lowest of these aeons, Sophia, makes a mistake, and this mistake results in the production of the physical material world, ruled over by a dark and ignorant ruler, Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth, Demiurge, forms the world into the cosmos, a reflection of the divine world above, even though he never saw the former. Yaldabaoth has 7 sons who rule over the 7 heavens, and once his work is complete, he announces himself to be the chief god who is above and beyond everything else. Sophia is not impressed with this and responds by informing him that there is actually deities above him, and her husband Anthropos makes an appearance. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, then makes an image of Anthropos in the form of Adam and Eve, although they were imperfect creations. Sophia has mercy on them by seeing their sorry state and imbues them with fragments of the divine. Later on, Sophia appears to Adam and Eve, and in later situations, Jesus himself does this as well, and informs them, and thus all of humankind, that it's learning that the human soul is really a fragment of the divine realm that releases a human being from Yaldabaoth's prison world and allows us to ascend to the pleroma from whence we came. Now, like I said, no one single Gnostic document or group or philosophy is going to lay out the story as plainly as I did just there. Some of these systems are going to have all of the parts that I mentioned and then some more. Others are going to have a very truncated version of the story that I just told you. But more or less, this is the Gnostic story that shows up in most, if not all, Gnostic documents. So now that we've talked about the story, let's talk a little bit more about the specific theological dimensions of the Gnostic story and evaluate them on their own terms. We'll start by taking a look at the monad. The monad is the idea of absolute being. It's the principle that existed before everything else. It's being beyond being, to use some highfalutin language. So essentially, all existence and all the cosmos was reduced to a single point, a single thing, the One. All things were the One, and the One was all things. And this is something that a lot of people who read the Gnostic documents kind of miss out. Because once aeons start getting emanated, and you have this pair producing this pair producing this pair, it's easy to assign the One to just another one of the aeons. It's just another one of this hierarchy. But in Gnostic thought proper, the idea is that the One is beyond the aeons. The aeons are produced by the One, but the One isn't reducible to just the role of an aeon. In fact, in some of the Gnostic systems, the Aeons don't actually know about the One. They're ignorant to its existence. And in one particular Gnostic system, that of Valentine, Sophia, the lowest Aeon's sin, wasn't attempting to reproduce without her husband, but rather her sin was attempting to ascertain the nature of the One. She tried opening up her mind to the depths that are the One, and was so overcome by what she saw and was unable to process it that she accidentally produced the mistake by error. The philosophical background for the One is likely rooted in the ancient practice of Pythagoreanism, or Neo-Pythagoreanism. Pythagoreans, rather predictably based on their name, thought that numbers carried something of the divine essence, or at least were ways of talking about the divine world through a rational mathematical formula. And this is the background of not only a lot of Gnostic speculation, but even a lot of Stoic and Platonic speculation. Basically, Pythagoreanism is really old and had a lot of emphasis on everything that came after it, including Gnosticism. Let's talk about the consort too, because there's always a female consort that shows up to the monad in every Gnostic system. This is one of the few universals in Gnostic theology that applies, to my knowledge, everywhere across the board, despite the diversity of Gnostic systems. The One has a thought, and again, the thought is different from the One in the similar way to how the mind and the brain are different from each other. The brain isn't identifiable with the mind, even though it sort of produces or houses it, however you want to break that down, essentially. And so, for the One to have a thought, now all of a sudden, there's not just one thing. There's the One, and also its thought. So, dualism is introduced. There's two now, and that two can become more. It's sort of unity disintegrating into plurality without getting rid of that original unity, and I think it's really cool. The philosophical background of the consort probably draws from a couple different places. There's Jewish antecedents in the myth of wisdom, there's Egyptian antecedents in the idea of Isis as she was understood by later Greek interpreters, and there's even Greek precedent itself in the myth of Eros and Psyche, which you can see some resonances of in a lot of the different Gnostic myths. And that moves us on to the idea of the Aeons. So the Aeons are really interesting because, well, for a couple of reasons. So first of all, they're spoken of as people, but also as places and as abstract ideas. Understanding what the Aeons are is actually really difficult, even if you have a background in Neoplatonic Greek philosophy, which is kind of required at this point. It might help to clarify that the philosophical background of the Aeons is likely found in something called Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism. These were forms of Plato's philosophy that were in currency around the time that Gnosticism came around. And it's implicit in Middle Platonism and explicit in Neoplatonism, the idea of emanationism. Emanationism is the idea that the One, that absolute unity, produces things by emanation. It's really difficult to describe, but essentially the Aeons are emanations of the One, not creations of the One. They're manifestations of plurality within the One itself rather than independent things that it makes. So the relationship between Aeons and the One is kind of like the relationship between my arms and myself. I am one thing. I'm a human being. I am a whole unity. And yet I can talk about my arm semi-independently. I can even portray it as though it's having a personality of its own, and yet it's still sort of a part of myself. Again, I can technically talk about it separately, as if it's just my arm, as if it's its own thing, but ultimately it's a part of a greater whole. That's probably the best way to understand what the Aeons are and how they operate. Although in a lot of Gnostic texts, they show a lot more personality than I could ever ascribe to my arm. Yeah, it's confusing. Don't feel bad if this is confusing. I've been studying this for literal years, and I still probably don't understand it as well as I should, and a lot of people don't either. So join the crew, essentially. Now, I mentioned a second ago that the Aeons are always a male-female pair, and that's also universal across the board in Gnostic systems. The Gnostic seems to have believed that the sexual binary is not just a social construct, but something that's intrinsic to the nature of existence itself. Now, it's interesting to note that in some Gnostic systems, you have a male Aeon and a female Aeon which cooperate together. In other systems, there seems to be the idea that these are a male aspect and a female aspect of the same being. That is, it's a hermaphroditic being, which is both male and female, and represents both of those ideas. Though one should also note that in the Greek thought of this time, the idea of a hermaphroditic being both male and female, and the idea of a male and female principle working in close concert with each other, those two ideas aren't as far apart as they might first seem. Most popularly, we can think to Aristophanes' speech in Plato's book, The Symposium. In this myth, Aristophanes describes the original state of human beings as being hermaphroditic. There were four-armed, four-legged, two-headed human beings, which were both male and female. They were incredibly powerful and were able to reproduce by themselves. And the gods were afraid of what humankind would be able to do if they were so powerful. And so they separated them into male and female halves to weaken their power, essentially. This, in Plato's thought, or at least Aristophanes' thought, is the reason for why the two pairs of a married couple were so attracted to each other. They were attempting to return to that original feeling of unity. And this isn't just Plato either. We find similar situations brought up in the myths of Attis and Cybele, in Phrygian mythology, similar things in Zervanism, and in Orphic material involving Zagreus. Technically Phanes, but he's also referred to as Zagreus. It's complicated. Fundamentally, the idea of there being a male and female element to the aeons seems to be the idea that they're capable of reproducing and generating another set of aeons, at least in some systems. And this actually has precedent in a lot of ancient mythological backgrounds. It's very common to see genealogies of gods, a male and a female, producing another male and female pair who produce another male and female pair all the way down. So while it's very theological and very philosophical and very abstract, it may also rely on just common human tradition about the generation of gods needing a male and a female, a father and a mother. So ultimately, it may go back to human allegory of, you need to create something? Well, you need a male and a female in order to do that. It's hard to say, because again, all the original Gnostics are dead, but that seems to be the general idea underlying the sexual binary of the aeons. Also, there is a numbering problem when it comes to the aeons, because every single different Gnostic sect described a different number of aeons that are in the cosmos. Some of them say there's as few as 8. That's great, because you can keep track of them all. Basilides, that little there's 360 of them. And he names them. So this moves us along to Sophia's accident. Remember, Sophia is the lowest of the aeons at this point. She and her male husband, Anthropos, are supposed to generate the next pair of aeons at this point. But Sophia gets a little bit ahead of herself and tries doing it without her husband. Because both pairs of the sexual binary weren't involved in this story, the result was catastrophic. A creature, and Gnostic texts describe the result of this as one like an abortive fetus. That is their description of Yaldabaoth. So they cut no terms with this one. They're saying, yeah, that's a mistake. That's what led to this whole problem in the first place. But what's interesting is that there's actually precedent for the idea of parthenogenesis in some Greek myths, specifically in the Theogony of Hesiod, which is the genealogy of the Olympian gods, going back to the Titans and the original cosmic gods and so on and so forth. Several deities within Hesiod's mythological system engage in parthenogenesis. That's to say, there's a female deity who produces children without the help of a male spouse. Similarly, there's the myth of Hera producing Typhon alone by herself, and this is a little bit closer to what we see with Sophia producing Yaldabaoth, because in that myth, Hera produces a monster without the help of her husband Zeus, whereas in this myth with Sophia, she likewise produces a monster without the help of her husband Anthropos. So it's not necessarily a direct borrowing from where the idea came from, but it does have precedent in some Greek thought. Before we move on, we should also bring up the fact that in the same flaw that produced Yaldabaoth, the one like an abortive fetus, matter was also created. The Gnostics were really antagonistic towards matter. They believed that the material world was derivative of the divine world, and therefore it's permanently changing and broken, and it's never going to be perfect like the divine world is. This has some foundations in the Platonism of its time. The Middle Platonists also identified the physical world as something prone to change, constantly changing, impossible to hold still, essentially. And this goes back to Plato himself. But the Gnostics were almost unique in their rejection of it, I suppose you could say. They really thought that the physical world and anything involved in the physical world was tainted and evil, and they sought to escape it. In fact, this is one of the primary things that drove a rift between the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists, because the Gnostics, as we'll talk about later, were heavily influenced by Neoplatonism. This was the philosophical movement of the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD, moving on into the Christian era. And the Gnostics agree with a lot of Neoplatonistic ideas, but Plotinus, the chief of Neoplatonism, criticized the Gnostics because they identified the physical world as evil and the creator of the physical world as evil as well. The Neoplatonists didn't believe that. Plato didn't believe that, but the Gnostics did. And so that drove a rift between them and the other Neoplatonists at the time. All right, now let's talk about the demiurge. Now, first thing I want to say is that in a lot of popular representations, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, is depicted as a lion-headed serpent. And this is really interesting to me because, to my knowledge, that depiction actually only shows up in one ancient Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John. Now, importantly, that is a very early and very important Gnostic text, but it's only one of dozens of Gnostic texts of that variety. And so he isn't portrayed as a lion-headed serpent universally across the board. It only shows up in this one text. That being said, it's really cool, and I think it's a really neat use of imagery. What's also interesting is that the idea of the lion-headed serpent isn't actually unique to Gnosticism. It's attested earlier in Greek interpretations of Egyptian mythology. The Greco-Egyptian deity Khnum, who is involved in astrology, is also portrayed as a lion-headed serpent in the time before when Gnosticism probably developed. Curiously enough, Khnum is likely based on the Egyptian deity Khnum, who, instead of being a lion-headed snake, is actually a ram-headed man. That Khnum is interesting for other reasons, and no, I do not know how he went from a ram-headed man to a lion-headed snake, but we're going to move on. In almost every ancient Gnostic text, the demiurge is called Yaldabaoth, although other names do exist like Saklas and Sabaoth and Samael and so on and so forth. In some Gnostic systems, though not all of them, Yaldabaoth is identified actually as the God of the Old Testament of the Bible. It's believed that God appeared to Abraham, God gave power to Moses, God made David the king, and the God that made the prophets speak his word was Yaldabaoth, the evil creator of the world. So clearly whoever held those beliefs was very hostile to Judaism at the time and saw the Old Testament as a catalog of war crimes against humanity carried out by the demiurge, the ignorant, blind god who's unaware of how anything works, basically. Now, like I said, this is mostly in later systems that we see this antagonism towards the Old Testament deity of the Bible identified with Yaldabaoth. In most early Gnostic systems, which derived largely from Jewish circles, as we'll talk about in a minute here, there isn't this identification made. The philosophical and religious background of the idea of the evil demiurge Yaldabaoth is probably derived from Jewish apocalyptic thought. Apocalyptic Judaism viewed the world dualistically. That's to say, there's a constant battle between light and darkness raging on through the cosmos, and Earth and the area surrounding it is enemy-occupied territory. Essentially, the Earth is ruled by demonic powers, sometimes with the devil stationed at the top, and with demons running the affairs of human beings. The difference between apocalyptic Judaism and Gnosticism, however, is that in apocalyptic Judaism, God, the same God as the Old Testament, by the way, is going to cleanse the world of demonic influence and drive the powers of darkness out, and then the world is going to be perfect like it was originally. In Gnosticism, on the other hand, the idea is that the world has to be abandoned to the devil, essentially, and in some Gnostic systems, the world is eventually going to be completely destroyed and consumed so that there is no world anymore. That's the major difference, but they do both spring from the same place. Now, Yaldabaoth is the former of this world, and so he seems to have possessed in the Gnostic myth some nascent memory of the world above him, how there were aeons organized into a hierarchy. And so he arranged the physical world out of the matter that he was born with into a hierarchy of its own. 7 heavens with an 8th surrounding it, and the earth in the middle, with 7 archons ruling over these different heavens. And again, this is basically an image of the realm of the aeons that exist outside of his own world, even though Yaldabaoth apparently is unaware of this realm. There's this nascent memory in him that he's following and building a replica of in his own mind. And the philosophical background of this idea probably lies in Platonism, because Platonism saw the physical world as being something of a reflection or a shadow, or even sometimes a mirror of the divine realm. It's basically matter, which is imperfect, being organized into things that mirror what's going on in the divine hypercosmic realm here on Earth, however imperfectly. In case anybody's wondering, this is actually the origin of the idea of as above, so below, which is a fundamentally Platonist statement. Now, interestingly, the classical names for the 7 archons are actually derived from the Old Testament of the Bible itself. And don't worry, we're going to get into the influences of Gnosticism in a second here. But essentially, in the Old Testament, there are a lot of different names that are used for the God of the Bible. He's called Elohim, he's called Yahweh, he's called Adonai, he's called Yahweh Tsabaoth, so on and so forth. And the Gnostics who read the Old Testament seem to have operated on the assumption that these are all different names for different deities, rather than different names for the same deity. And so, while they identified Yaldabaoth as the chief god of the Old Testament, they identified Elohim, for instance, as a different god, not as a reference to that same god. And so that's where they get the names for the 7 archons. There are other names for God in the Old Testament that they scatter to the 7 archons of Yaldabaoth in Gnostic myth. I think it goes without saying that the whole Adam and Eve story that Gnosticism involves finds its roots in Judaism, specifically in the book of Genesis, with the story of Adam and Eve found there. Gnostics subverted this myth by switching out the roles of God and the devil, essentially, and portraying the deity in the garden as being a little bit more malevolent than the one that we're used to. If at this point you're a little disoriented and discombobulated, good. That's about where you should be at this point. To make things easier for you, here's a little map of the Gnostic imagination as I've been able to ascertain it. Starting with the monad and the aeons, working our way down into Yaldabaoth's realm and the places where the archons rule in the heavens above the earth. Let's talk a little bit about the anthropology of Gnosticism, sort of how they see humans, because the Gnostics agreed with a lot of ancient writers in thinking that humans were sort of part material and part divine. There was something cosmic going on and also something very mundane going on with the human creature. And so the Gnostics would assign the physical aspect of human beings, our physical, changeable, and corrupt bodies, to the creation of Yaldabaoth, the former of all things on earth. But they would ascribe the creation of the soul to something of a higher power from the good realm of the Pleroma. And so human beings possess an imperfect physical body and a perfect spiritual soul, which is going to survive the death of their body and move on to the good place from which they came. In the Gnostic myth, Yaldabaoth makes forms of humankind in imitation of the aeon anthropos, which he saw in the cosmos above him. Anthropos is the Greek word for human being. And so it's interesting that Yaldabaoth saw the deity, human being, and made an image of human being. And this draws probably primarily on the Jewish idea of humans being made in the image of God. Yaldabaoth created humans in the image of this higher power that's above even himself. As for the creation of Adam and Eve specifically, this is where all of the Gnostic accounts again diverge dramatically. In some Gnostic accounts, Adam and Eve are both created by Yaldabaoth and are both given souls by Sophia. In another tradition, Adam is the only one created, and Sophia, or one of her offspring, themselves descend in the form of Eve to bestow knowledge to Adam. And there's actually 2 or 3 other systems besides these. So there's a lot of variety by the time we hit the Adam and Eve story, but you get the idea that Adam and Eve are very important to Gnostic mythology all the same. Likewise, some Gnostic theologies hold that some human beings have souls and other human beings do not have souls. This is probably to explain why some people are intelligent and alive and seemingly good, and other people are deprived, unintelligent, and brutish. Some Gnostic myths explain this by there being 2 generations of humans, one by Adam and Eve, which produces humans that have souls, fragments of Adam and Eve's own souls, whereas the sons of Yaldabaoth, the archons, sleep with Eve and produce offspring that way as well, who do not have souls because they're the descendants of the archons themselves. And so this explains why some people have souls and others don't. But not every Gnostic system is this explicit with this idea. The idea of how the soul gets into the human being is also various between different Gnostic systems. In one tradition found in the Hypostasis of the Archons, Sophia looks down at the inert creation of human beings that Yaldabaoth has made, and she herself places the soul inside of each of them. In another tradition found in the Apocryphon of John and elsewhere, Sophia actually tricks Yaldabaoth into breathing breath into the nostrils of Adam, and this actually drains Yaldabaoth of whatever creative power he had, and all those fragments of light that originally belonged to him then flow into the human beings that he creates. So now let's talk about soteriology. Soteriology, fancy word, basically means the theology of salvation. So in the Gnostic system, again, there's no sacrifice for sins. There's only the remembering of who you are and where you come from. In the Gnostic system, human souls are fragments of the divine realm, and by having knowledge, gnosis, distributed to them by the aeons of the cosmic realm above, they're able to remember where they come from originally. And then when the human body perishes, rather than the soul remaining in this world, maybe getting caught up in another body and being reincarnated, will instead ascend beyond this world into the pleroma from whence it came, and be reunited with the aeons that it came from. So Gnostic soteriology revolves around gnosis, the realizing that you're a fragment of the divine and that you need to escape this mortal coil in order to return to the place from whence you came. That's essentially Gnostic soteriology in a nutshell. This is a point that I really want to hammer down here because when people hear gnosis and they realize it means knowledge, they jump to a lot of conclusions, especially when the early Christians were saying, we don't like gnosis. They're not saying we don't like scientific knowledge. They're saying that this is a different soteriological system than the one that they inherited from the followers of Jesus. So I want everybody to listen real closely to me here. Gnosis in the Gnostic term is not scientific knowledge. It isn't general knowledge or intelligence about the world around you, and it isn't even general spiritual knowledge about this or that revealed from the divine place. It is specifically
the divine revelation to a human being that your soul is a fragment of the divine pleroma beyond Yaldabaoth's reach, and that by realizing that Gnostic system, you can escape this cosmos and return from whence you came. That is what Gnosis is, according to Gnosticism. Gnosis in Gnosticism is always distributed by some intermediary or another. Most cases, it is Sophia herself who reveals it to the first people, and they write it down in books and pass those down to their descendants, which is how Gnostic teachers in substantially later time periods justify the existence of these ostensibly ancient doctrines. They would say that, well, the books that we have today, we didn't write them. They're actually really old, and they go all the way back to Adam and Eve, you see. Other Gnostic systems would say that Seth was their revealer, sometimes identifying Seth as a spiritual being, and still other Gnostic systems would say that this or that angel is the revealer of knowledge. Christianized Gnostics identified Jesus as the revealer of Gnosis. He's identified in these systems as an aeon from the divine pleroma who comes down into the dark world, not to save sinners from their sins, but to tell us all about the fact that we're actually fragments of the divine and that it's time to go home. So now that we've established the story of Gnosticism, we've talked about the ideas of Gnosticism, let's talk a little bit about where Gnosticism came from. Because it didn't just pop onto the scene fully formed out of nowhere, it had philosophical precedents. So first, we're going to take a look at the philosophical influences on Gnosticism, sort of how all of these elements found their way together into this system that we just described. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the story of how those elements probably came together, or at least we'll do our best. So let's start by talking about the Greek influences on Gnosticism. Gnosticism emerged in a world that was thoroughly Hellenized. Greek culture was everywhere. In fact, Gnosticism probably popped on the scene about 300 years after Alexander the Great had conquered the entire world. By this point, Rome is sort of becoming a thing and is expanding its influence, but even in the Roman period, they kept speaking Greek to everybody, because everybody, from Italy all the way over to Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, spoke Greek, and Greek culture was everywhere, essentially. It didn't always completely replace the cultures in other nations that Greek was spoken in, like in Arabia or Israel or Asia Minor, but there was always access to Greek ideas and Greek philosophy. And so pretty much everything that happened after the conquest of Alexander in this part of the world was influenced in some way or another by Greek philosophy. The two most popular philosophies that were in circulation at this time were Platonism and Stoicism. Stoicism doesn't really show up in contact with Gnosticism a whole lot, and that shouldn't be a huge surprise to us. The Stoics believed that the physical world itself, in a sense, was divine, was God. In fact, they also believe that the physical world is all that there is. The cosmos, the stars, that's the extent of all existence. This is completely contrary to Gnostic belief, which believes that physical matter and the universe that we live in was a mistake. It's the creation of a dark ruler, and there is a cosmic realm beyond it. So despite the popularity of Stoicism, we don't see a lot of influence of Stoicism on Gnosticism, but Platonism is a different story. So Plato lived and operated in the late 5th and early 4th century BC, and he was undoubtedly, if not the most, then one of the most influential philosophers of all humankind. Something all Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes on Plato, the famous quote. But it's not that much of an overstatement, because Plato essentially laid the foundations of modern philosophy as we know it. And everything that came after Plato was just better answering the questions that Plato was asking, essentially, at least in the West. Now, Plato believed that there were two sets of reality that were permanently existing. He believed in the spiritual realm, we'll call it that, an oversimplification, but the spiritual realm of the forms. This is the cosmic realm beyond everything else, and this is the perfect realm where everything is ideal and perfect. And the forms that exist in this realm are ideas. They're things like width and height and length. Things like the idea of a chair is Plato's perhaps most famous use of this. Whereas there's also physical matter. Physical matter is also eternal. It always exists, but it doesn't really have any qualities in and of itself except for things like hot and cold and light and dark and heavy or light, things of that nature. So essentially, Plato believes that you have this cosmic divine realm of ideas, immaterial above, and the very physical, earthy, substrate world below it. And in between these, there is a figure called the demiurge. This is the idea where the Gnostics get the idea of the demiurge from Plato. But in Plato, the demiurge looks up at the realm of the forms, and he sees all these ideas floating around. And then he looks down at the physical world, which doesn't have much form of its own, but does have the potential to become things. And so the demiurge looks up and gets ideas from the realm of the forms, and then he molds the physical world into shapes and ideas based on the concepts in the forms. And so for Plato, existence is a thing that's partaking in both physicality and in the ideal realm. If you want to read more about this, read Plato's book, The Timaeus. Timaeus is fascinating. It's really cool. And you also get similar ideas in Phaedrus and Phaedo. I would say start with Timaeus, move to Phaedrus, and then a little bit in Phaedo too, although that's mostly about the human soul. Speaking of Phaedrus, Plato also believed that the human soul was capable of ascending beyond the realm of matter and up into the spiritual cosmic realm of forms, but this was very difficult to do. It was accomplished by philosophy, and anybody who wasn't able to escape the physical world would inevitably be reincarnated back into it. Well, we read a lot about that at the end of Plato's Republic, but the primary source talking about this ascent are, again, Phaedo and Phaedrus, Phaedrus being more important for talking about the ascent of the soul into the cosmic realm there. So already you can see the connections with Gnosticism here. The idea of a spiritual realm and a physical realm, the idea of a former who models the physical realm after the ideas of the spiritual realm. A lot of these are Plato's ideas, but importantly, Plato himself was not a Gnostic. This is a mistake that a lot of people make. Plato didn't think that the creator of this world is evil. Plato didn't think that matter is intrinsically evil either. Plato believed that matter was imperfect. Again, it didn't have form or shape by itself. It was just sort of the Play-Doh that the demiurge formed everything out of. And so because it's constantly changing and subject to change, of course, whenever you build something, it's going to fall apart again. But he didn't think that it was intrinsically evil. He actually thought it was a good place to be and that you could actually live a good life in the world. There were also a couple of other influences from the Greek world on the development of Gnosticism, but Platonism is the primary one. Another major influence was Pythagoreanism, but by the time Gnosticism rolls around, Pythagoreanism had kind of merged with Platonism at this point, so I don't think it's worth discussing as its own topic. Moving on from the Greek influences, there was also a very major Jewish influence on the development of Gnosticism as well. And this comes out most strongly in the idea of Sophia. In Jewish wisdom literature, the concept of wisdom itself is often represented as a woman, Lady Wisdom, who teaches wisdom to anybody who's going to come and listen to her. This began as a metaphor as far back as the book of Proverbs, with the idea of Lady Wisdom being a metaphorical concept of wisdom teaching people how to live proper lives. In the time that came after the book of Proverbs in the intertestamental period, and especially during the Greek occupation of Israel, we see the idea of wisdom actually being explored as a divine being, something that comes from God and assists God in the molding of the universe. This comes out in Alexandrian Jewish documents like the Wisdom of Solomon, and it's also found in other books like Baruch and the book of Sirach. So in the wisdom tradition of Judaism, we already start to see this idea of a female element which is produced by God, which is not identifiable with God, but which is a spiritual being very early on in the process, which assists God in the creation of the universe. And already we can see the parallels here and how this influenced Gnosticism. We see a parallel first and foremost, I think, with the idea of the consort, the female principle or the thought that was generated by the one. Although couched in Platonic and Pythagorean terms, the idea of a female consort who assists in the creation of the realms seems to derive ultimately from Judaism. Likewise, we see the influence of the Jewish wisdom myth on the figure of Sophia, because in Greek, Sophia is the word for wisdom. And so when Jewish Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, their discussions of Lady Wisdom came out as Lady Sophia. It seems probable that Greek readers of Hebrew texts, which seem to personify wisdom or Sophia, assumed that Sophia was an actual Hebrew goddess and seem to have picked up the idea from there. Judaism also played a role in providing the character of the demiurge. Although the idea of the demiurge is largely derived from Platonism, influences from Judaism show up here as well. Primarily, the God of the Old Testament is portrayed as being Yaldabaoth himself. So basically, the evil, ignorant God of this physical world is actually the God who's behind the stories of the Old Testament. So in one, big moth. Ooh. So in one sense, the Gnostics simply took the Old Testament of the Bible and read that the deity in those books as if it was just the bad guy in the whole story, right? But Judaism contributed to the Gnostic myth in another way as well. Again, around this time, apocalyptic Judaism was very popular. And apocalyptic Judaism held to the idea that there was an evil ruler of this world. Now, apocalyptic Judaism distinguished between the evil ruler of the world as it is now from the good creator of the world. But Gnosticism collapses this distinction. It believes that the evil ruler of the world is the evil creator of the world, whereas Judaism held these two apart, as two different people. So as we can see, the two primary elements that formed Gnosticism were Greek, primarily Platonic thought on the one hand, and apocalyptic and Hellenistic Jewish thought on the other hand. But the combination of Jewish and Platonic ideas wasn't unique to Gnosticism. In fact, there was actually a tradition of combining Greek and Jewish ideas especially in the city of Alexandria, for several centuries by the time that Gnosticism shows up on the stage. The best example of this is Philo of Alexandria. He was an Alexandrian Jew who was raised in a very Hellenistic society, but still held to his cultural roots and saw Moses as a great philosopher like Plato. Similar to the Gnostics, Philo also identified the demiurge with the creator god of the Old Testament. But this was Plato's demiurge, not the Gnostic demiurge. And so Plato's good creator and former is who Philo identified with the god of the Old Testament, believing them to be one and the same, essentially. And like Plato, Philo held that the world was good and was the result of a good creator. So we see that already in ancient Alexandria, there was the mixture of Greek and Jewish ideas. And it's probably here in the same place that Gnosticism also arose as an alternative form to what we find in Philo and other Hellenistic Jewish writers like Aristobulus. Now, I just mentioned that the primary place where Jewish and Hellenistic ideas were merging was in Alexandria, and that's true. Alexandria was a Greek city built on Egyptian soil with a large Jewish population and came under Roman rule at a later time. These facts, combined with the fact that it was a port city, meant that Alexandria was a hub of cultural activity. There was a lot of ideas being intermixed around here. And it wasn't just Jewish and Greek ideas, but Egyptian ideas as well. In 1987, Douglas Parrott wrote an article arguing that there was a serious Egyptian influence on the theology of Gnosticism, referencing primarily the Hermopolitan philosophy and theology of ancient Egypt. In 2015, Thomas Gaston of Oxford wrote a similar article arguing that Parrott was essentially right. There is serious Egyptian influence on the development of Gnosticism as well. The primary parallels that people can point to is that in a lot of ancient Egyptian myths, and there are a lot of different ones, the gods are portrayed as being the divine Ennead, this set of 9 gods, with the original creator god and male-female pairs following after him, mirrors the succession of aeons in Gnostic theology. Likewise, in some Egyptian myths, we have the idea of one god tearing himself apart or disintegrating into many other gods, which is an idea that flows very well with the Neoplatonic idea of emanationism and may have further bolstered Gnostic ideas of the same. Similarly, the Hellenized Isis cult understood Isis, the goddess, to be the being which sort of allows for contact between humankind and the Divine One, similar to how Sophia works as the interaction between human beings and the One as well. So Egyptian elements in Gnosticism seem probable, but they probably weren't as thoroughgoing and widespread as Greek and Jewish ones, but they were probably still there. Now, that being said, it's important to note that most Egyptians weren't too keen on Gnosticism for a couple of reasons. One, it was taking Egyptian myths and sort of spinning them in a non-Egyptian direction, which they weren't particularly fond of. What they were even less fond of was how Gnosticism sort of decried the physical world as evil. The Egyptians, like the Stoics, view the physical world as good and divine in some sense as well. So while they could agree with the Jews that the world was good and agree with the Stoics that the world was divine, they couldn't agree with the Gnostics that the world was evil and the result of a mistake by an evil creator either. And so Egyptians weren't too keen on Gnosticism from the very beginning, it seems. So those are the primary influences on Gnosticism. Now, can we put together a more or less coherent story of how it all came together? I would suggest yes, that we can. The primary place that people look to for this story is Alexandria. Again, this is a Greek city on Egyptian soil with a large Jewish population. In fact, a large slave force from Judea was exported to the city in order to construct the city itself by Alexander. So from the very beginning, there were people with these Jewish ideas there living in a Greek city on Egyptian soil. It's the perfect melting pot to produce the alloy of Gnosticism that we see. So the origins of Gnosticism probably went down something like this. There was a large Jewish population living in Alexandria. Alexandria was also the home to multiple different philosophers from the area, including Platonist ones. Many Jews were drawn to Platonism because it has a lot of similarities to how they viewed their own God. And so the idea of Platonic ideas being imported into biblical theology is already present in writers like Philo of Alexandria, who combined philosophical ideas from Platonism with theological ideas from Judaism into the same thing. At the same time, though, Philo was a big fan of both Plato's ideas and Moses' ideas, but there were other people who maybe weren't so keen on either of them. Probably some philosophers, originally Hellenized Jews, put together a system that sort of was an alternative to either Platonism on the one hand and Judaism on the other hand. It was something completely new. Probably the earliest Gnostic system was put together in Alexandria in Hellenized Jewish hands here. As time went on, more and more Gentiles became involved in this as well, and Gnosticism began to lose a lot of its Jewish flavor. Then, around 30 AD, another theological development takes place in the world. Christianity is born and begins to proliferate around the world. We don't have a story for how Christianity came to Alexandria, at least not an early one, but we know that it was in Alexandria from a very early time. And when Christianity came to Alexandria, the Gnostics were, of course, interested in the Christian idea. And so many Gnostic systems and Gnostic philosophers, and there were probably already a broad variety of them by that time already, adopted some of the ideas of Christianity into their systems without committing themselves to the Christian faith. This is why typically when we read Gnostic systems, we see Jesus sort of shoehorned into a pre-existing system that he kind of doesn't belong in. It would be like if you're reading a Buddhist tractate about how the Buddha managed to overcome all the influences of this world and transcend to the one beyond it in very Buddhist terms, and then all of a sudden, oh, Jesus did the same thing. It's kind of like, okay, that kind of came out of nowhere. You had this whole system taken care of, and then Jesus is suddenly there. Like, okay, I guess. But nevertheless, a lot of Gnostics were drawn to the figure of Jesus, and they portrayed him and saw him as a revealer of knowledge, similar to how Sophia or Seth was in the past. I should also note that not every Gnostic system did this. Even in the time of early Christianity, after Christianity had developed for several centuries, we still find Gnostic sects that don't have any discernible Christian characteristics, and other Gnostic documents that likewise don't have any Christian characteristics in them at all, or if they do, they're just sort of hammered onto the edges of it and don't make a whole lot of sense in their context, being clearly later additions. So not all Gnosticism was Christianized, but as Christianity became more and more popular, Gnosticized Christianity likewise increased in popularity too. So Gnosticism was probably originally a form of Hellenized Judaism, which took on more and more Gentile influence as time went on, and then after the introduction of Christianity, it began to take on, in some circles, Christian elements as well, though again, not every aspect of Gnosticism did this. And I think that's about enough on Gnosticism for one video. But don't worry, we've got a lot more Gnosticism coming down the pipeline. So if this is sort of your thing, as it is mine, then feel free to subscribe and stick around, because I'll be back to you sooner than later. I guess in summary, Gnosticism is really cool. It's one of my favorite things to study, and outside of my own religion, Christianity, it's probably my favorite religious system out there. So there's going to be a lot more to talk about. Again, I'm planning on making plenty more videos like this, but I am very tired, and it is time to start editing this massive project. So this is going to be fun. Anyways, I hope everybody enjoyed. Take care of yourselves, and have a great rest of your day.
And this practice can be accomplished by the acquisition of knowledge, of gnosis. That was pretty good. I ad-libbed the last part.